Those lights are very hot.
Yeah.
Well, now that everybody has settled back in,
Yeah,
I'm David Sanger from the New York Times, and if you've made it this far, the end is in sight. We hope that we have saved the best for last for you. We certainly have an all-star panel. This is supposed to be a panel about the end game. When I left my reporting job in Tokyo as the bureau chief for the Times 21 years ago, I remember coming on my last trip to Korea and conducting a series of interviews with Korean officials, Americans here, all kinds of North Korea experts, asking them basically the question of how long they thought the North Korean regime would last and what the preparations were for regime collapse, implosion versus explosion, all those issues that we think about today. And when I think back about those interviews, the closest in interview, and I won't say who it was, but it was somebody pretty senior in the Korean government, was that the regime wouldn't last longer than 18 months. This was 1994. And the far out was that they might be able to hang on for about 7 years, given the level of sanctions and all that. So when we talk about massive intelligence failures, and certainly we've had our share of some of them in the United States over the years, our intelligence failure in just understanding what it is that keeps North Korea together and why the end game hasn't happened yet is probably one of the biggest examples of our absence of an understanding of just the glue that is holding the place together. Fortunately, we have a panel today that will answer all of that and beyond. And I'll ask each of them to give us a 1 to 7 year prediction at the end. See how they do. So let me introduce our panel. To my immediate left, my old friend, Ambassador Chun Young-woo, who's a senior advisor to the Asan Institute now, but I knew him as National Security Advisor to President Lee and Vice Foreign Minister, where he played many critical roles and was widely quoted in probably the most vivid of the WikiLeaks columns. So we enjoyed a lot of laughs about that later on. But I have always found him to be one of the most interesting on the subject of the North Korean regime. I've learned a huge amount from him, as I have from Sid Seiler, who is sitting next down there. He's special envoy for the six-party talks at the Department of State. One would think this is a job that would leave him with a lot of extra time on his hands, since we haven't had any six-party talks, but he tells me that it manages to keep him busy nonetheless. He coordinates all the U.S. efforts on denuclearization. He was the director for Korea at the National Security Council. And I think one of the things that really brings Sid enormous credibility in the interagency debates in Washington is that he's basically spent 3 decades, mostly at the DNI's office and the CIA and to some degree the NSA, on a number of different positions, but really focusing on North Korea. And so he's in the best position for telling us why in 1994 we thought it was 1 to 7 years, or somebody did. He has written Kim Il-sung, 1941 to 48, The Creation of a Legend and the Building of a Regime. Just down next to him is Zhang Tusheng, Senior Fellow and Chairman of the Academic Committee and Director of the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the China Foundation for Strategic Studies. He was an instructor at the PLA's Military College, a research fellow at the PLA National Defense University Institute for Strategic Studies, and has written on U.S., China, and EU relations. and managing Sino-American crises in a series of case studies. Noboru Yamaguchi, Lieutenant General, professor at the International University of Japan, was senior defense attaché at the Japanese Embassy in the U.S. From 1999 to 2001, and vice president of the National Institute of Defense Studies, and was a national security fellow at the Olin Institute of Strategic Studies at Harvard. Down on my far left, Sven Jurczewski. Did I pronounce that incorrectly?
No.
I'm sure I've got it wrong. Please correct me.
Jurczewski.
And Sven is a retired Canadian Foreign Service officer. He specializes in political military affairs, and he told me that his value in the as a Canadian negotiator, he could always measure by the number of times the Canadians would send him unescorted to North Korea. But he has managed to get through all of that and served in missions, the Canadian missions in Berlin and Bonn and New Delhi and Lagos and Vienna and Zagreb. So let me start with a few questions here, and let me start first with Ambassador Chun. So, Ambassador Chun, we've talked before about the difference between the end of a regime and the end of a state. And those great 1 to 7 year predictions I was hearing were all about the end of the state. Tell us now that we are, 3 years in, just about, to the rule of Kim Jong-un, about how you assess the viability of Kim Jong-un's North Korean state right now, and how well his twin approach of economic reform while pushing forward in the nuclear arena is working out.
Well, David, I would start by saying that the North Korean regime, as we know of, is not going to be sustainable. But I don't think it will collapse in the next 18 months or 7 years. But we have to distinguish between regime, end of the regime, and end of the state as North Korea. Unlike many other countries, in North Korea, in the minds of the North Korean people, Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader, is identified as same as a state. So people will believe that when the regime is gone, the state no longer has any meaning to exist. But by general standards, international standards, I think the state will survive until the successor regime. I think the successor regime will be there, will replace Kim Jong-un regime when it ends. And if it fails to muddle through and lose control of the country, then I think we can think about end of the state, end of North Korea as a state. But I think it will be a protracted, messy, bloody process. That's my prediction. But how far are we from the end game? I think nobody can tell, actually. All I can say is that this is not a sustainable regime. But if you look at the twin policy, was Byung-jin policy, the signature policy of Kim Jong-un, I think it's making progress. And I wouldn't underestimate Kim Jong-un's policy. And even though reform is a dirty word in North Korea, and they don't use the terminology reform, but I think he's very serious in reforming, improving the ways to manage the economy. I think the agricultural reform, no serious study has been conducted yet on the result of the agricultural reform, but I think dividing the collective farms into family scale small farms I think this is a revolutionary thing happening in North Korea, and giving the farmers, the freedom to dispose of, to sell their produce in the markets, except a certain percentage, 30% or 40%. I don't have the exact number, but paying taxes to the government. And that kind of reform has never been attempted in North Korea. And the reason, I think, there has been no famine. We haven't been hearing famine even if we had a serious drought last year. I think we may have to look into further studies in the future, but I think it may be a result of economic reform, agricultural reform, and even in managerial reforms. I think it's fundamental change now. Giving more leeway to the managers of the state enterprises to manage their company. And I think Kim Jong-un is also very audacious in sending North Korean workers, officials, to overseas. I think there are maybe more than 100,000 North Korean workers in the Middle East, in the Siberian, forests for logging in China, Mongolia. So that has been helpful in making up for the losses in foreign currency earnings that they had to endure because of the sanctions. So I think, there is no serious pressure upon North Korea to denuclearize. Sanctions, the nominal sanctions are in place, but they don't really bite North Korea. So they are not paying very much price for keeping their nuclear weapons. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Kim Jong-un may succeed on his Byungjin policy. So, and I think
let me ask you about the other side of it. So one side is obviously the economic reforms, which you've described, I think, very well, how they've done something somewhat akin to what Cuba has attempted. But on the nuclear side, in the Iran negotiations that we've all been reading and writing so much about, one of the features of it is that as sanctions have gone up, production of fissile material went up as well. And so, the Iranians use this to argue that the sanctions in the end were a failure if what the sanctions were intended to do was to stop them from producing that. Others would dispute that, say it brought them to the table. But in the North Korean context, we're now hearing about a significant potential increase in the size of their arsenal. Are you telling us that what is essentially 70 years of sanctions policy is now less successful in stopping them from producing bomb-grade material than it's ever been?
Well, in the case of Iran, factually, you are right that Iran has been increasing its enrichment capability while sanctions were in place. But I wouldn't see any causality between the sanctions. Without sanctions, I think they could have done more, or not less, at least. So I wouldn't see any causality between sanctions and improved or heightened enrichment activities in Iran. In the case of North Korea, sanctions on North Korea are partial. They are targeted only on military sales and luxury goods. Even if all these sanctions work perfectly, that will affect only, I think, about 10% of North Korean external economic activities. Even if all these sanctions work, that will not be enough to change the strategic calculus of North Korea. So under the current sanctions, North Korea has no reason, no incentive to denuclearize. So, but I wouldn't, I would caution against overestimating North Korea's pace of building up their nuclear arsenal. Some people say, in a few years they will have 20 nuclear weapons, maybe 100 nuclear weapons in a matter of 10, 20 years. Well, when we don't have any accurate intelligence about what's really going on in North Korea, everybody is free to make a speculation on the basis, whatever. There maybe agenda may help them to come up with any result. But what I would like to caution against is that overestimating North Korea's nuclear capability would play into North Korea's game, because what North Korea wants is that regardless of whether they actually have the capability to enrich uranium as much as many outside experts predict, they achieve their objective if the outside world believes that they are really capable of, reinforcing their nuclear arsenal at the pace that some Washington experts have been predicting. Then they can use that. Even if they have to come back to the six-party talks or bilateral deal with the U.S., they have a better chance of maintaining what they already produced, because they can raise the sense of urgency in the U.S., in the ROK, Japan, elsewhere, that is better now. Forget about complete denuclearization. Let's settle with just any future additional buildup of nuclear arsenal. Let's just cap nuclear capabilities. That's the realistic goal that we can achieve. So in order to encourage this kind of argument, and if North Korea's objective is to retain the existing nuclear arsenal, it is in their interest to exaggerate, or the other countries, other experts exaggerate their actual nuclear capabilities. That plays into North Korea's game. So, when it comes to intelligence, I know that underestimating or overestimating, both of them are wrong. But in the case of North Korea, I think overestimating could be worse in the sense that it could play into North Korea's game.
Well, Sid, you have been wallowing in the black hole of North Korean intelligence now for a few decades, and you escaped by going off into the policy world. So we won't make you defend why it is we are having a hard time coming up with these numbers. But take on Ambassador Chun's central argument here, which is that the North Koreans have a motive for exaggerating the pace at which their arsenal is increasing. Let's expand that to say not just the nuclear side, but the missile and missile range DES side. That they're trying to gain an urgency to this. And yet at the same time, in my travels in Asia, and I'm certain you hear the same in yours, I hear a lot of people saying, what is it with this administration that they are so focused on keeping Iran from gaining fissile material that we don't see the similar kind of energy, attention from the Secretary of State and others on forcing North Korea to at least freeze and roll back?
David, that's an excellent argument, an excellent question, and I think, let me say a few things about what I call the epistemological foundations of our policy. In other words, what is the degree to which we understand the issue with which we're dealing, so that we can make the appropriate policy without getting locked into some blinders as to some preconceived notions, to be principled and pragmatic and yet flexible enough to exploit opportunities that become available. And I would argue that when it comes to North Korea, for everything else that we've experienced over the last 2 decades in trying to pursue complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of the North, is that we've acquired a good amount of empirical evidence on North Korea's ambitions, its intentions, and indeed its capabilities, so much so that we can have what one could call a sufficient base of information and understanding of North Korea to have good policy, And in that regard, and I think that's the origin of what we characterize, we capture as our 2-track approach, or our sharpening choices approach, that is not so dependent upon entire thorough understanding of North Korea's intentions beyond what they've demonstrated, or capabilities beyond what we know, but takes serious the threat, whatever state it's in, understands that as we seek a negotiated settlement to this and remain flexible in terms of our willingness to engage the DPRK, and we have repeatedly, we've engaged in exploratory talks, what I like to say, to probe intentions, to prod them to make the right decisions, and then to prove our assumptions. As we remain open to that type of exploratory dialogue and show a willingness to engage with a country like the DPRK, as we've engaged with other countries with whom we've had past difficulties, we do so in a very pragmatic way, understanding that in addition to our diplomatic efforts, we need to maintain the type of pressure that we have in place in terms of sanctions, the degree to which we can impede the growth of the program so that it's not as qualitatively or quantitatively advanced as the DPRK otherwise would have liked, by denying them the cash profits, the hard currency necessary to roll back into their program, by stigmatizing the policy choices that the regime has made, so that there is a price to be paid, as it were, for the choices that it makes. Ambassador Chun makes a very good point on the fact that our sanctions, as of today, currently target primarily the WMD activities of the DPRK. They're not designed to go after the livelihood of the normal North Korean people. To that degree, perhaps they haven't fully exerted the pressure on the leadership to coerce it back to the table. But what it has had the effect of doing is reduce the likelihood of proliferation and, again, impeded the growth of the program to the degree to which we can influence it from the outside. And as we pursue the diplomatic solution, as we remain open to dialogue and seek a way back to authentic and credible six-party talks that result in concrete denuclearization actions that begin with a halt to the program and move down the roadmap we're all familiar with, of freeze, disablement, dismantlement, abandonment, we take the due diligence necessary in the terms of our deterrence. The program, for whatever state it is, the growth of the missile capabilities, the growth of the nuclear arsenal, these are issues we take very seriously. That's why we work very closely in our alliances with the Republic of Korea and Japan to ensure the necessary deterrence. This is why we pursue trilateral security cooperation. This is why we're pursuing the missile defense architecture necessary to respond to the threat. So at the end of the day, the failed policy here is not of the United States, the Republic of Korea, or the other three parties, but the failed policy is that of the DPRK. Because in spite of the massive investment that they've put into the program and the resultant diplomatic and economic isolation that they suffered, the nuclear weapons have earned the regime nothing.
Tell us how we should think a little bit. You mentioned before the goal of denuclearization, but this panel's also about thinking about the end game, which would basically be thinking about unification. How much of these are these in tension?
You know, that's an excellent question, because I think this is tied to our larger strategy in the region, where we seek, through our engagement through traditional alliances, through the multilateral institutions, through the presence that the United States has in the region, the diplomatic engagement we have to promote the types of values, rules, and norms that we believe bring true peace and prosperity, the liberal political order, the free market-based economic order, the respect for human rights, that these broader objectives of our Asia policy also speak to our sharpening choices. Because what we want at the end of the day is to see a Korea Peninsula where all 70-some million Koreans from Paektusan down to Hallasan, from the furthest reaches of the north to the south, enjoy the same peace and prosperity, freedom, human dignity that the people in the south, the Republic of Korea, have enjoyed. In that regards, our sharpening choices, our effort to remain open to engage North Korea, to reach out to its people, to paint a picture of an alternative future that is much different than the current arduous march path, and now renamed under Byungjin, which is inevitably going to lead back to another arduous march, because they're not going to have the economic development they seek while they fail to denuclearize, so that we can paint a picture of an alternative path. And in that regard, our policy today, and this also ties in my colleague's my colleague, Special Envoy Bob King, who leads our human rights efforts, working with the international community to raise attention to the human rights situation in North Korea, to seek ways to hold those responsible accountable for their actions, so that we demonstrate a whole-of-government, multi-pronged approach to the DPRK that seeks a transformation of its behavior and its nature, so that we lay the groundwork in the process for the type of future we all want to see. Again, a future that's been articulated by President Park, and indeed President Obama on a number of occasions when he's come here during his various visits, has articulated a Korea Peninsula free of nuclear weapons, a Korea Peninsula free of war, and a Korea Peninsula that's just frankly free. So there's a natural relationship between our pursuit of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and how we approach this issue, and also how we lay the groundwork for the potential reunification that everyone seeks.
Well, we'll come back to that in the general discussion. Let me turn now to Dr. Zhang and ask him, so we've heard that the sanctions affect maybe 10% of the economy. One of the biggest differences between the sanctions on Iran was that all of the surrounding states pretty well worked on enforcing them. The biggest critique you would hear over the years is that China has not enforced many sanctions on North Korea, still allows the oil to flow, still has trade going, doesn't like their nuclear program, but doesn't want to see the regime collapse. And now we've seen the arrival of a new president in Xi Jinping, who, from all outside observations, doesn't have the kind of warm historic affection for the North Korean leadership that some of his predecessors of a different generation did. So tell us a little bit about whether you see a change underway in how China is dealing with North Korea, whether you think that there is a change of the calculus on continuing to provide the lifeline to North Korea that China has, whether you can imagine any situation in which the end of the North Korean regime might be in China's interest.
I think China's policy towards North Korea and the Korean Peninsula, basically speaking, has not changed. We have several key points. The first is peace and stability. The second is denuclearization. And the third is we should try our best to end the Cold War situation in the Korean Peninsula. And the last one is support the independent and the peaceful reunification. But since Xi Jinping became the president, someone said China has changed a little bit. Because now China hasn't met the new North Korean leader. And also China's economic sanctions has become more strictly. And so my understanding like this is totally my personal understanding. First, China put the nuclear denuclearization as the priority. In the past, we stressed peace and stability. Why? Because when Xi Jinping became the president, very soon North Korea has the new satellite launch and nuclear test. So if something violated, damaged the situation, so we should attach more importance to that. But if in the future, North Korea will not make new nuclear test, new satellite launch, and if the situation between the South and the North, the North Korea with the United States became a very dangerous military confrontation, I think at that time China will put the peace and stability as the priority. So it depends. Secondly, I think if there is some change, that is China put more importance to the Sino-ROK relations. And now we try to, both sides try to strengthen the strategic cooperative partnership. It's very important because our very strong economic relationship, because our culture exchanges, and we have a similar position on a lot of issues. The thirdly is China still try to play a unique role. In the past, China, yes, maybe China's sanctions is not very not very serious. But now we think we should have how to say, two-hands policy. On the one side, we should try our best to persuade North Korea not to develop nuclear weapons. It's not in your interest. So China followed the UN Security Council's resolution, and our sanctions on North Korea has increased. But on the other side, China still believes we can play a unique role. That is, now North Korea has a two-track strategy. One is to continue to develop nuclear weapons. The other is to develop its economy and to improve the people's living standard. China tried to do something on this side because I think it's in the interest of North Korean people's interest. And also, we can urge them to gradually to make some reform and openness. I think it's only China, maybe partly for the South Korea, can play this kind of role. Very difficult for other countries. So China still two hands. The last one is maybe different from before, yes. That China, more experts believe we should prepare for the worst case scenario. And, but of course, we don't think there will be a regime collapse in the near future. We don't think so. And, but prepare for the worst case scenario is necessary. But the goal should be very clear. That is crisis management, conflict management, and the consequence management.
Can I ask you just briefly, because on this last point you make about preparing for the worst, even if you don't think it's going to happen. You know, over the years, there's been a lot of discussion about whether China, the United States, South Korea, Japan, could all hold a conversation, presumably a fairly quiet one, about what you would do in the case of collapse. You don't want a situation where everybody is racing in to seize and secure the same nuclear weapons. You don't want to have a condition in which American forces and Chinese forces might end up meeting, even if accidentally, in North Korea. We all did this in 1950, 51, 52, and I think we've all come to the conclusion there has to be a better way. So do you think that the new Chinese leadership is open to a discussion about how one would prepare for North Korean collapse?
Now, I think between China, Chinese colleagues and American colleagues, there's a difference. Most of the American colleagues always believe there would be a regime collapse. But for Chinese colleagues, most of them don't believe it will happen in the near future and even in the medium future. But there is a danger, two dangers. One is if North Korea in the near future, they had make more nuclear tests and they successfully has the missile test, then the situation would be very, very dangerous. So at that time, what US will do, And this is something very dangerous, because at that time, North Korea could become a state, just like India, Pakistan, and Israel. That is the de facto nuclear state.
Don't you think they are already?
If they have new tests and they have new nuclear materials. So if this happened, whether we accept this, but another thing is there may be, I think there might be some military conflict. Who knows? But it's very dangerous. We have to prevent it from happening. And the other thing is now the South-North relationship is very bad. And also the armistice regime also has been paralyzed. So if there is accidental military conflict between the North and South, several times have happened in the history in the Western Sea. So if this happened, and if it has isolated, and now there are so many joint military exercises surrounding the area, so we have concerns that it could cause a military serious conflict. During this situation, how to control the nuclear facilities, nuclear security issues, how to avoid the China and the US to fight each other again, just like that in the 1950s? Of course not. We should try our best to avoid this. And also refugee issues could happen. So a lot of things, not because of the regime collapse, but could caused by the accidental military conflict.
Okay. So Yamaguchi-sensei, as you have heard all these opinions so far, I think it's fair to say that we see different perceptions among the 5 members of the 6-party talks here about both what could trigger collapse or continuation of the regime, what the utility of increasing pressure and sanctions are. You see a little bit of difference on the question of what the goals of the North Korean regime may be right now. So talk us through those a little. Tell us what kind of differing perceptions you see.
Yeah, thank you. I see the consensus among us. We want to see non-nuclear, stable, peaceful, finally unified Korean Peninsula, and without any military conflict on the peninsula. But there are a couple of different aspects of those goals. One, non-nuclear, and perhaps missiles and other delivery means, not only nuclear weapons, but rather other weapons of mass destruction. North Korea is well known about having chemical, biological weapons too, and also conventional forces too. They have tremendous conventional capabilities, and they have North Korea has domestic problems too. So those problems has different aspects. And if you ask a question, ultimate action, a quick question to all of us, which is the most concerned threat? There may be a slightly different, and slight difference. And then something really happens, that difference becomes really serious. And for instance, if North Korea does another satellite test or another long-range missile test, perhaps Japanese may be very much mad because we are concerned about missiles, and perhaps not so much for the stability of on the peninsula as a whole. So there may be some kind of difference in.
Well, Japan might well be mad, but we heard Ambassador Chun say here that North Korea really hasn't paid much of a very large price at this point for those missile tests, for those nuclear tests. I mean, some people on this stage could recite in their sleep the talking points that are, you know, by doing this test, North Korea only deepens its international isolation. Sid, you have to write those lines for people, don't you, sometimes?
Isolation matters me. You know, missile tests, because of North Korea, Japan is a country which is very slow to adapt to new kinds of systems. But in terms of ballistic missile defense, we used to be in a good shape. We have Aegis destroyers and Patriot missiles. People are so concerned about missiles. But people may not be that much concerned about short-range missiles, which may be most concerned for the Korean people or even the Chinese neighbors. So we have to share those concerns among us. Otherwise, North Korea may exploit the gaps between us. And plus, my concern is their high mobility, mobilization rate. They have 1.2 million young men in uniform. This is a lot. I counted I went through the Japanese history. At the end of the Second World War, 1945, we used to mobilize 7% of the whole population. In case of North Korea, it's over 5% for decades. It is self-destructive in terms of economic healthy. This is another aspect we have to watch if we want to see peaceful unification for the future. To me, obviously, unification of the peninsula is a goal, and how we achieve that goal is a question to me.
Sven, you've been enormously patient sitting down there, but since you're Canadian, one of the great privileges of being Canadian is that you're free to criticize how larger powers have mucked things up in the course of this, right? So you've been to North Korea any number of times. You've talked to the North Koreans. You obviously have talked to your colleagues here. What went wrong with the six-party process? We haven't had a six-party meeting, I think, during the entire Obama administration. I think it ended in 2009, just as he was coming in. So answer that and then tell us, is the six-party process even worth pursuing if you have as the objective here the denuclearization that Sid told us about, which the North Koreans have made clear from their constitution on down that they're actually not really especially interested in?
In '99, I was asked by Prime Minister Chrétien to go to North Korea to effect Canadian recognition of North Korea, and I was there over the next 4 years 19 times. This was in support of the Clinton soft landing policy. Clinton, as you may recall, after the framework agreement, American policy developed into something more emollient and forthcoming, and with due recognition of the consequences of another struggle on the peninsula. When I arrived in Beijing and looked at all this stuff, I realized I didn't know very much about North Korea, and I came to the conclusion that perhaps apart from the Chinese, neither did anybody else. The SIGINT was useless, to be honest, and there wasn't much HUMINT. I established a research program, about 25 kids, who did a lot of research, and all my trips to North Korea were predicated on deciding which versions of the results of the research were correct. I had amazing access in North Korea from Kim Jong-nam, at that time the president, down to peasants in the cooperatives and factory workers. And especially I met frequently with KPA general staff officers. At the time, there was substantial agreement amongst the major players, China, the US, the ROK. And things were actually going forward quite smoothly. The climate change came with the election of the Bush administration. We had a disastrous visit by Kim Dae-jung to Washington, where the sunshine policy was trashed. I can tell you this caused in China, I got enormous support from the Chinese side in doing this work. I can tell you this caused enormous consternation amongst the Chinese and deep confusion in Pyongyang. Deep confusion. The six-party talks were a Chinese initiative which arose out of these difficulties and out of the less than forthcoming, the change, the climate change that resulted in from the Bush administration, the abrogation of the six-party talks, the abrogation of the framework agreement, and various other things like the axis of evil speech. These things had real consequences for the climate of opinion in Pyongyang, and what I learned and what I was told and what I experienced. I have to say at that time there was also not a clear policy direction in Washington. It seemed to me, from my perspective in Beijing, that there was a confusion between hawk engagement and regime change. There's no question about that. And that had consequences. That had consequences in Beijing. That had consequences in Pyongyang. Could they deal with the US in a consequent and open manner? In addition, as the what I called at that time the Diutai talks, but the six-party talks, domestic agenda items of the various partners got involved. Now, these were all worthy in themselves, the question of Japanese kidnap victims. But that distracted from the main objective of dealing with the nuclear weapons. And I have no objection to the Japanese for domestic and also for moral considerations to pursue this. But it is not arguable from my perspective that it took away from the emphasis on the main, what should have been, to my mind, the main focus. And there were other things like that came about. Basically, the intrusion of domestic political agendas into the negotiation process. I have to say also that the picture of North Korea that we had is wrong. It is not a hegemonic state. There are vast levels of disagreement in the state. There was a party that I would speak to, the APPC, the FDRC, more liberal elements in the foreign ministry and the trade ministry, liberal elements in the Central Committee, that favored an opening to the US and an emollient stance in the six-party talks. By the same token, KPA generals and people in heavy industry ministries were adamantly opposed. So what you would get is an advance in the talks and then an outrage from North Korea. And of course, a response on the part of the US and its allies. So the whole thing was not going forward. And of course, eventually died. Let me ask, go on, is a collapse imminent in North Korea? I don't believe that for a minute. I don't believe that for a minute. And if there is a collapse, it will be nothing like the GDR of Poland. It will be catastrophic and could involve, as a measure of redirect, a KPA attack on South Korea, which, to my mind, could quickly resolve itself into a nuclear exchange. The level of constraint in the KPA General Staff in the use of nuclear weapons is far lower than I have ever experienced anywhere else. And so Chinese concern about the possibility of a meltdown is real. And it's one that I frankly share. In the first hours of a war in Seoul, I was told by an expert here in Seoul when I was here at that time, 50,000 dead in the first 6 hours and $100 billion in property damage.
Would that be with a nuclear or a non-nuclear?
No, that would be, as was told to me by General Ri Chong-bok, commander of the KPA forces at Panmunjom, Mr. Swen, we have taken you along the DMZ. You have seen our artillery emplacements. You know we can turn Seoul into a sea of fire. That was his statement. He also told me, this was right after the first successful phase of the Iraq War. I said, General, what are the lessons of the Iraq War for Korea? Never give up your nuclear weapons. It opens you to American attack. The level of fear in North Korea about the U.S. cannot be overstated. It is a country in which the pathologies of psychiatric medicine have a place in political discussion. There is no question about that.
Sid, let me ask you, just to follow up on Sven's observation here. He's essentially making an argument, which you've heard elsewhere, I'm sure, that if you're North Korean and you're looking out at the rest of the world, you see an Iraq that had an active nuclear program in 1991, didn't by 2003, and got overrun. You see a Libya that turned over its nuclear program, not yet weapons, in 2003, 2004, and there probably was a moment when Muammar Gaddafi was running across the desert on the way to his ultimate fate, where he probably stopped for a glass of water somewhere and said, you know, that wasn't my best moment, giving all of that up. So how do you deal with this from a policy viewpoint, that our actions, whether you approve of the actions, don't approve of the actions, think we did or didn't do the right thing, the actions of the past decade may have reinforced to the North Koreans the thought that giving up your weapons is just a prescription for letting your regime get toppled over sooner or later?
Well, two things immediately come to mind in that regard. First would be urging the leadership of the DPRK to live in the reality of the present. And this is a administration that has taken risks, that has shown flexibility, that has engaged countries with whom we have traditionally had difficult relationships, who has shown no ideological opposition to sitting down and talking with the DPRK. But we have, you know, fortunately, because of 20 years of experience dealing with the DPRK, the pluses and minuses, the lessons learned of the agreed framework, the lessons learned of the six-party talks, and the lessons learned in the last 6 years, you know, we can go in very pragmatically and very realistically, knowing what the standards are to know whether we're really back at authentic and credible negotiations or not. So first of all would be to live in the present. The second would be to consider seriously what value that they're deriving from this capability. What is the threat that they're facing? In this regard, the continued relevancy of the six-party talks framework, I think, speaks to the environment in which the DPRK, should it make the right decision, could come back to the table. We have in the six-party talks framework all the regional players who are most involved in this issue, who can bring the most benefits to the DPRK, who can ensure that each of us work together to address the legitimate, not the illegitimate, the legitimate security concerns of Pyongyang, that can address the economic and energy needs it claims to aspire to in response to moving down the path of denuclearization. In this regard, the September 19th, 2005 joint statement, which has certainly been trampled on repeatedly with 3 nuclear tests, restarting the 5-megawatt reactor, pursuit of a declared uranium enrichment program that adds to the difficulties we had even going back in concerns of their undeclared uranium enrichment program. The six-party talks framework is the best environment that if the DPRK really does want to explore what it would be like to move down this path, to explore better relations with the United States, to explore normalization of relations with Japan, to explore the path back into the Non-Proliferation Treaty and integration back into the international community, to begin to check the boxes necessary for the sanctions that have been imposed under a number of United Nations Security Council resolutions, which reflect the international community's consensus call on the DPRK to denuclearize. Pyongyang can look at that environment as the environment to which it gives lie to the narrative that they face a perpetually hostile external environment that prevents them from exploring that path. That would be my answer to that.
Mr. Zhang, what do you say to that?
Okay.
First of all, we've got to develop our fact set. We have to understand North Korea. I've been to a lot of miserable places for Canada, and DPRK is sui generis. It is like no other place I've ever been. I had to change my mind about a lot of things many times over. They are practiced builders of Potemkin villages. So, you know, you can to go down this path of understanding them better and where they're coming from and why. You could analyze it from three different perspectives. One is, what is their governance? Well, it's Leninist democratic centralism. What is to be done? It's right in their constitution, I think Article 2B. Question that comes out of that is who's in charge? You know, as a matter of logic, and knowing and having talked to KPA general staff officers, I don't believe that they respect the fat kid. Okay? I don't. The fat kid is there because of Juche and how it works, and that he's a Kim. But that is a speculation and a hypothesis on my part. That needs proof. We have to look at that seriously. Secondly, what is the economy doing? Well, the economy has bottomed out, and they're growing at 1.5% to 2.5% a year. That, in fact, is not good news for us in two ways. One, our levers over them are less. And two, if we take the ruminations of E.H. Carr on the Russian Revolution right, the most dangerous period from a revolutionary and meltdown standpoint is a downturn after a period of increase. The Russian Revolution was caused by a 5 kopeck rise in the price of bread. So we've got to look at that very seriously and how that impacts. Lastly, is their belief structure. What do they believe? And I find that Western analysis of Juche is unbelievably primitive. They are not, the first thing the Chinese told me, we don't understand the North Koreans very well. They broke their links with Marxism long ago. And I will answer what they do believe with a little story.
You know, let me hold on to your thought for a minute, because I just want to get a few more voices in here. Dr. Zhang, as you hear this argument that's laying out about what incentive sets we have set out for Kim Jong-un, do you believe right now that we have the right set of incentives that would actually... I'm asking Dr. Zhang to see if he'll pop in here for a second on this.
For me?
Yes.
Oh, I think it's for him.
I was asking you if you think from a Chinese perspective that we have the right incentive sets right now to draw the North Koreans back into the six-party process, or whether you think that's basically a lost cause.
About the nuclear issue, I have 3 points. The first, the time is very limited, I have said. If all the parties don't do anything, they will go across the nuclear threat, become a de facto nuclear states, very dangerous, high risks. Second point is we should take the advantage of the progress on the Iran nuclear issue talks, so to restart the six-party talks. But the only precondition should be the September 19th joint statement, not others. Otherwise, very difficult to restart the. Some American colleagues told me, in fact, when they have some contacts in Singapore, the North Korean has, to some extent, accept this precondition.
These are the September 19, 2005.
Yeah, it's very important. But if we asked more preconditions, very, very difficult.
Sid, you've been involved in these conversations about what kind of preconditions to set up for the talks. Are you in agreement? Is it the September 19th, 2005 agreement is the only precondition, or is there a longer list here?
I think this should be the only preconditions.
Right, I was asking Sid just to react to that for a sec.
Well, I don't want to get into the details of our diplomatic discussions or what we would particularly exactly want to state, but I think everybody can make an agreement that the value of resumed six-party talks that lead to concrete denuclearization steps is that they would bring a halt to the type of troubling activities we've discussed here. The operating of the reactor, the spinning of centrifuges, the growth of the program. These things were all in the letter and spirit of the 9/19, the September 19th statement, areas in which North Korea committed to stop doing. These are things that are proscribed by standing United Nations Security Council resolutions, and they all run counter to the spirit. It's hard to imagine how talks would be authentic and credible while North Korea continued to attempt to engage in dialogue while keeping these critical elements of its weapons program spinning. Talks for the sake of talks inherently have no deliverable. There's no evidence. The history of our dialogue with North Korea having made repeated attempts, and this is where we build upon the experience, like I said earlier, of the agreed framework and the six-party talks. We know what authentic and credible talks would look like, what negotiations would look like, and this is what we would expect North Korea to be willing to do if this was a sign of their seriousness of purpose. The DPRK is well aware of that. They're well aware of the good things that would potentially come, the alternative path. This was, in many ways, at the heart of the February 29th, 2012 understanding that we came to with North Korea, where they agreed to halt at that time the declared elements of their program in exchange for improvements in the relationship and confidence building measures that we would be prepared to live up to.
And that lasted almost a month, as I recall, didn't it?
Exactly, and you can't fault the understanding. You fault the partner that decided that the incentives that were engaged in there and the goodwill that was being expressed in there was of no interest to them at that time, for whatever reason. Right. And I don't want to speculate on that analytically, but the two paths remain quite clear, and this is why we keep getting back to the sharpening choices language.
So, Ambassador Chun, the picture you laid out for us was one in which the sanctions weren't hurting that much, you said 10% of the economy. The country is moving to a position where its nuclear program is almost what the Israelis in an Iran context would call getting to the point of no return. So, what do you think Kim Jong-un's game plan is from this point forward?
Well, let me say that North Korea, I agree with all others that North Korea attaches a sacrosanct value to nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons for North Korea is not only the holy grail of the theocracy that Kim Jong-un inherited, but it's also an ultimate insurance policy for their survival. But I don't agree with those who believe that North Korea will never abandon its nuclear ambition under any circumstances. I think the strategic calculus now is structured to encourage North Korea to move ahead with nuclear armament with impunity. That's the problem. I think that's the fundamental problem. under the current sanctions regime, even if I were Kim Jong-un, I'm more liberal than, open-minded than Kim Jong-un, but I wouldn't, in his position.
I'm glad to hear this, by the way.
Would have any incentive. And, you know, we heard General Chang's position on North Korea's, China's policy toward North Korea. Yeah, with all due respect to his remarks, I think even if you are thinking about the problems of North Korean people as different from the problems of regime, to the extent that you expand trade in areas not covered by UN Security Council sanctions, North Korea would not take your position against nuclear armament very seriously as long as you are subsidizing North Korea's economic development in the name of helping the helpless, innocent North Korean civilian people. Yeah, I think we have great sympathy for them. But unless, so what China is doing is to not only to reduce the pains for North Korea, but to actually make North Korea better off than before the sanctions by drastically expanding trade in non-sanctioned items. And that's, I think this is a serious problem. So economically, I don't think North Korea is far worse off because of sanctions, because the way China has been going around sanctions. I know that China is technically in compliance with the Security Council sanctions only, but this covers, as I said, only a tiny proportion of North Korea's foreign economic activities. So, but I don't believe that sanctions can resolve our problem. I don't think sanctions by themselves will force North Korea into denuclearization. What sanctions do is to strengthen the hand of diplomacy. So even if North Korea comes back to the six-party talks, under the current circumstances, it's not just for the talks for the sake of talks. For North Korea, this would be talks for the sake of avoiding denuclearization, for the sake of legitimizing their nuclear armament. This is worse than talks for the sake of talks. That's, I think, what North Korea's game plan would be if they are invited out to the six-party talks without any commitment from the North Korean, from North Korea to September 19 joint statement or any concrete steps that would make their commitments credible. So I think that's the issue. But we also have to, sanctions alone will not strengthen the diplomatic hand, because diplomacy is the only way we can peacefully denuclearize North Korea. So we have no other option than relying on diplomacy. But to empower, to strengthen diplomacy, we need not only a new concept of sanctions, more comprehensive sanctions that really bite North Korea, but we also have to sweeten up the incentive packages. And many, the six-party partners think in terms of economic incentives. But in North Korea's valuation system, pricing system, political security incentives are more valuable for them than economic incentives. So we have to restructure the incentive package as well to make North Korea more, to make them more interested in denuclearization. So
let me briefly ask Yamaguchi-san to step in on that question. Yeah.
Yeah. Just I wanted to say there is a good news. We have not seen nuclear explosion on the actual target for the 70 years. For the next 30 years, we don't see that. That counts as 100 years. That is what we'd like to see. And if you look at the Asian countries, South Korea is a success story, and China is a tremendous success story. Japan is too. 1945, September 1945, Japan was nothing, but now we are like us. So that can be the models for North Korea, and we have a room to show the models for North Koreans.
Let me just, because we're getting right down at the end of our time here, but I didn't want to do this without having any questions from the audience. So let's just take 2 questions from the audience, send it out, and then we will, I think, be coming to the end of our time. So we'll get one right here, and where was the other? Okay.
James Acton from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I have a question for Special Envoy Seiler. You've argued that sanctions are important because they help retard the North Korean nuclear program. I would argue there's a growing body of evidence that North Korea is increasingly capable of indigenizing the capacity to build centrifuges. Do you agree with that? And if you do agree with that, is it necessary to think beyond sanctions, and what does that look like?
I think some sanctions are necessary. It shows the international community's position, and also especially those things that has a linkage with the nuclear program development. So we should keep this kind of sanctions. And if in the future North Korea take more nuclear tests and satellite and the missile tests, maybe the sanctions will increase. So, but North Korea is very different from Iran. Iran has an economy more open to the world. They have interdependent relationship with the outside world. But North Korea is not. Very isolated for so many years. So I don't think the sanctions is the main instrument for us to solve the problem. So we must be practical. The best way is still to resume the talks. And the future, in the near future and the medium future, the goal should be freeze nuclear program. That's very, very important. Only after that, we can only go forward to realize a comprehensive and a package of resolution to realize the goal of denuclearization.
Sid, do you agree with that? Would a freeze do it? Could you imagine something, just drawing a lesson from the past 18 months from the Iran situation where we had a temporary agreement that froze some, rolled back a little, but didn't give any? Can you imagine a package like that that would be a model for the North Koreans? And can you imagine that they would have thought, based on what's going on with Iran, that that would even be in their interests?
I don't know, but at least I think there are 2 very important developments. One is the U.S.-Cuba relationship has been improved recently, and the other is the Iran nuclear issue. The talks has made progress. I hope they can learn something from that.
Sid, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I mean, this is basic denuclearization 101, isn't it? We know that the road to complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization, which is the goal of September 19th statement, is the objective of the entire 6-party talks process, is a consensus of the 5-party members and certainly the international community, that the road to CVID starts with a stopping of what's going on now. And so it's almost an artificial argument. It plays into the characterization of those people who would criticize our policy as insisting that the North denuclearize before talks resume. And actually, it's somewhat disappointing that what comes out of certain propaganda pieces emanating from Pyongyang about their unwillingness to come back to talks and the high standard we set has such an audience. We have not asked that North Korea abandon each drop of plutonium and each ounce of uranium enrichment before coming to the table. But we all know that the road of authentic and credible denuclearization begins with a halt to operations, to activities underway. But of course, that can never be an acceptable end state because the true destabilizing nature of the nuclear program of the DPRK on the Korean Peninsula and in the region, and actually globally, requires CVID, requires complete verifiable.
Ambassador Chen, you get the last word.
Well, since I have devoted 2 years of my career to denuclearization in the 6-party talks, I cannot resist temptation to add a few words. Well, I think the freeze may be a first step in the road to full denuclearization. But I think the context is important. Freeze as final step. What North Korea has in mind is its final step. That means that they may agree to capping the existing capabilities, and they would forego any additional production of fissile material. That's what they have in mind, I think. So freeze in the context of full denuclearization is one thing. Freeze as just, as a self-standing step, final step, that's totally different thing.
And that would leave them as a nuclear weapons state.
That would legitimize North Korea's nuclear armament. And what I would like to add is that what is more important than freeze? We know what freeze is all about. Because if we are talking about the Yongbyon plutonium-based program, we know what's going on there already. And even if they restart or they operate the plutonium program in earnest, I think they'll be lucky to produce maybe one nuclear weapon in 1 or 2 years. So it doesn't make a whole world of difference, if they already have 5, 6 nuclear weapons. Adding one more in 2 years, that's not going to be, well, it's serious enough, but not that. But I think more important than freeze is actually correct and complete declaration of their clandestine enrichment program. Because we do not know. Even if we reach any agreement, we do not know what we have agreed upon. The moment we believe that we have denuclearized North Korea, they may be operating a new enrichment facility up and running in the back door. That would be a nightmare. Right. So honest declaration of enrichment program as a starting point, I think would be more valuable than freeze of the known, what they have declared, the Yongbyon nuclear facilities. That's my final word.
Well, unfortunately, because we have run out of time, I have not had a chance to ask each of the panelists how long they think the regime will last. But it's been a very useful conversation. I think we've sort of fleshed out what some of the differences are as each of the different members of the 5 parties and the 6-party talks look at this, and why the challenge here has actually gotten more complex over time rather than less. And so I thank you all. I think Dr. Ham's got a few last words for us, so as soon as we get out of your way, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.